The Cold War produced some of the most extraordinary human decisions in modern history. On one side, Soviet citizens risked everything: prison, death, the erasure of their families, to get out. On the other side, a much smaller and stranger group of Americans went in the opposite direction. They walked away from the most prosperous country on Earth and chose the Soviet Union instead. Some were spies, some were idealists, some were running from something, some were chasing someone. One went for a waitress he met at a hotel bar. One packed his children into a Chevrolet and drove to the airport. One rolled out of a moving car in the New Mexico desert, using a trick his own government had taught him. One ended up in a psychiatric hospital 30 miles outside Moscow for 20 years, while his family had no idea he was alive. None of them found what they were looking for. What they found instead is one of the strangest chapters of the 20th century. Section 1. Lee Harvey Oswald, the Marine who walked into the Soviet Union. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in New Orleans on October 18, 1939, 2 months after his father died. His mother remarried and the family moved constantly. By the time Oswald was a teenager, he had attended 12 different schools. At age 12, he was placed in juvenile detention for truancy, where a psychiatrist assessed him as emotionally disturbed due to a lack of normal family life. At 17, he joined the United States Marines. He turned out to be a better-than-average marksman, qualified at the sharpshooter level, but he was a difficult soldier. He was court-martialed twice, once for accidentally shooting himself with an unauthorized pistol, and again for getting into a fight with a sergeant he believed was responsible for the first punishment. He was jailed both times. While serving in Japan, he began teaching himself Russian. This was not a common thing for a Marine private to do in the late 1950s.
In February 1959, he was invited to take a Marine proficiency exam in written and spoken Russian. His spoken comprehension was rated poor, but his reading and writing were considered reasonable for someone with no formal instruction. Something was building in him. He had been reading Karl Marx since he was 15. He described Soviet society as the answer to what he saw as the rottenness of American capitalism. He told fellow Marines he was a communist. Some avoided him. Others thought he was performing. Either way, by 1959, Oswald had decided he was done with the United States. On September 11, 1959, Oswald received a hardship discharge from the Marines, claiming his mother had been injured in a workplace accident and needed his care. The discharge was granted 3 months before his regularly scheduled separation date. He spent 2 days with his mother in Fort Worth, then he left. He boarded a ship in New Orleans, sailed to France, traveled to England, and from England made his way to Helsinki, Finland, where he obtained a Soviet tourist visa in less than 48 hours. He arrived in Moscow on October 16, 1959. He was 19 years old. He had saved $1,500 from his Marine Corps salary. Within days of arriving, his in-tourist guide informed him that his visa was expiring and he had to leave the country. Oswald refused. On October 21st, the day his visa was due to expire, Soviet officials told him his application to remain had been refused and he had to leave that evening. Oswald went back to his hotel room and cut his left wrist in the bathtub, intending it to look like a suicide attempt serious enough to delay his removal. It worked. Soviet authorities sent him to a Moscow hospital, where he was kept under psychiatric observation for a week. When he came out of the hospital on October 28th, Soviet officials asked him again whether he wanted to return to the United States. He said no. He insisted he wanted to live in the Soviet Union as a Soviet national. He had already written a handwritten letter to the Supreme Soviet requesting citizenship, stating, "I want citizenship because I am a communist and a worker. I have lived in a decadent capitalist society where the workers are slaves." 3 days later, on October 31st, 1959, Halloween, Oswald walked into the United States Embassy in Moscow and told consular official Richard Snyder that he wanted to renounce his American citizenship. He placed his passport on the desk and handed over a written statement declaring that his allegiance was to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. He told Snyder that he had voluntarily informed Soviet officials that he would reveal everything he knew about his work as a Marine radar operator, and that he might know something of special interest, a likely reference to his time at a U-2 spy plane base in Japan. Snyder warned him that renouncing citizenship was a serious and potentially irreversible step. Oswald did not back down. He left the embassy without completing the formal renunciation paperwork, but the message was clear. He sent a handwritten letter to the embassy a week later, confirming his request. "I, Lee Harvey Oswald, do hereby request that my present United States citizenship be revoked." The story of a former U.S. Marine walking into the Soviet Union and offering military secrets made the Associated Press and United Press International wire services. It was reported across the country. His mother, Marguerite, was devastated. His brother Robert wrote to him, asking him to reconsider. Oswald wrote back, dismissing the concern. The Soviets, for their part, were not sure what to make of him. KGB files later showed they suspected Oswald might be an American intelligence plant, sent to gather information under the cover of a fake defection. They did not grant him citizenship. Instead, in January 1960, they sent him to Minsk, in Soviet Byelorussia, to work as a lathe operator at the Gorizont Electronics factory, which made radios, televisions, and military and space electronics. They gave him a subsidized apartment and a monthly government stipend on top of his factory wage, which put his total income above that of most Soviet workers. KGB informants were assigned to monitor him. He did not love Minsk. His diary from this period records a man sliding from idealism into boredom and frustration. He wrote that the work was dull, the social life limited, and that the Soviet people did not seem particularly interested in him. He had imagined arriving as someone significant. Instead, he was an anonymous foreigner doing factory work in a mid-sized city. In March 1961, he wrote to the American Embassy in Moscow asking about the possibility of returning to the United States. This was less than 14 months after he had publicly denounced his citizenship and offered military secrets to the enemy. The same man who had placed his passport on the embassy desk in contempt was now quietly writing to ask if he could come back. That same month, at a trade union dance in Minsk, he met Marina Nikolaevna Prusakova, a 19-year-old pharmacology student. They married on April 30th, 1961, 6 weeks after meeting. Marina was the niece of a Soviet MVD officer. American investigators would later note this connection, though no evidence emerged that she was a deliberate intelligence placement. The process of getting Oswald and Marina permission to leave the Soviet Union took over a year. The Soviets were slow to issue exit visas. The American embassy had to navigate the question of whether Oswald had legally renounced his citizenship. He had never completed the formal paperwork, so legally he remained an American citizen, though the State Department flagged him as a security concern. On June 1, 1962, the embassy gave Oswald a repatriation loan of $435.71 to cover travel costs.
On June 13, 1962, Oswald, Marina, and their infant daughter June arrived in the United States, landing at Hoboken, New Jersey, aboard the ship Masdam. He had been gone 2 years and 8 months. He returned to almost no public attention, which frustrated him. He had expected journalists, interest, some form of recognition for what he had done. There was essentially none. His Marine Corps discharge had been quietly changed from honorable to undesirable after his defection became known.
He wrote to the Secretary of the Navy, at the time John Connally, who had since left the post to run for governor of Texas, demanding the discharge be reversed and threatening to employ all means to right this gross mistake. The letter was forwarded to Connally's successor. Nothing came of it. The family settled in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Oswald struggled to hold jobs. He was difficult with co-workers and supervisors. He moved between employers. He remained politically active in a scattered way, distributing pro-Cuba leaflets in New Orleans in the summer of 1963 under the banner of a one-man chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. In September 1963, he traveled to Mexico City, where he visited the Cuban and Soviet embassies, trying to get a visa to Cuba and permission to return to the Soviet Union. Both requests were denied. He returned to Dallas in October 1963 and got a job at the Texas School Book Depository. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed as his motorcade passed through Dealey Plaza. Oswald was arrested 90 minutes later at a movie theater after a Dallas police officer was also shot and killed nearby. He was charged with both murders. 2 days later, on November 24th, while being transferred between jails, Oswald was shot and killed by Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby in front of live television cameras. He was 24 years old. The Warren Commission, which investigated the assassination for nearly a year, concluded that Oswald acted alone. A 1979 House Assassinations Committee report suggested there may have been a second shooter, but named no one. The question of whether Oswald's time in the Soviet Union connected to anything larger has never been definitively resolved. What is documented is this. A 19-year-old Marine walked into the Soviet Union with an offer of military secrets, spent nearly 3 years there, grew disillusioned, came home with a Soviet wife and almost no public profile, and less than 18 months later was standing in a 6th-floor window above a presidential motorcade. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next American to defect went to the Soviet Union the same year Oswald did, and like Oswald, he went for reasons that had very little to do with ideology and everything to do with a woman he met at a Moscow hotel. Section 2. Robert Edward Webster, the man who defected for a waitress. Robert Edward Webster was born on October 23, 1928, in Tiffin, Ohio. He grew up in Pennsylvania, served in the United States Navy during World War II as an electronics specialist, and after the war built a quiet civilian life. By the late 1950s, he was working as a plastics chemist. He had a wife. He had 2 children. He had a mortgage and a job, and the ordinary shape of a life that millions of Americans were living at exactly that moment in history. In November 1957, he applied to work at Rand Development Corporation, a Cleveland, Ohio-based company that worked at the edge of American industrial and scientific research. He was hired as a plastics specialist. The job was legitimate industrial work, but Rand Development had threads connecting it to American military and intelligence circles that Webster may or may not have been fully aware of. What he was aware of was that in 1959, his employer was sending him to Moscow. The occasion was the American National Exhibition, a landmark cultural event held in Sokolniki Park in Moscow in the summer of 1959. The exhibition was an American government-backed showcase of consumer goods, technology, and domestic life, designed to demonstrate to Soviet citizens what life under capitalism looked like. It was here, in the same exhibition where Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev held their famous kitchen debate about washing machines and the American way of life, that RAND Development had a display featuring industrial plastics technology, including a spray gun that represented the cutting edge of American plastics manufacturing. Webster traveled to Moscow several times in 1959 to help prepare the exhibition. He was good at his job. He knew the product. He knew how to talk to people. And during a 7-week stay beginning in May 1959, he met a woman named Vera Platonova. Vera Platonova was a waitress at the Hotel Ukraine, the enormous Stalinist-era skyscraper on the banks of the Moscow River, where many foreign visitors to the exhibition were housed. American investigators who later studied Webster's case noted that she was suspected of being a KGB agent. Whether she was assigned to him, or whether the relationship developed naturally, is not something the available record settles definitively. What the record does show is that Webster fell for her completely and immediately, and that by July 1959, less than 2 months into the relationship, he had already decided he was not going back to Ohio. On July 11, 1959, Webster approached Soviet officials at the exhibition and asked about the procedures for an American citizen to remain in the Soviet Union. This was a significant step. He was not testing the water or asking hypothetically. He had already made up his mind. Over the following weeks, he had several more meetings with Soviet officials. During one of those meetings, he told 2 Soviet scientists that he could help them duplicate the RAND spray gun that was on display at the exhibition. He was offering his industrial knowledge as a credential, a reason for the Soviets to want him. He was trying to make himself useful enough to stay. The Soviets were cautious, as they always were with potential defectors. Foreign nationals asking to remain in the USSR were automatically viewed with suspicion. The KGB's working assumption was that anyone offering themselves too eagerly might be a plant sent by American intelligence to gather information from the inside. Webster was processed slowly. He was moved around, observed, questioned. Soviet officials ushered him through the bureaucratic steps of applying for residency, and at some point during this process, according to the Congressional Defector study compiled after the Kennedy assassination, the officials got him drunk before presenting him with the residency application paperwork. When Webster filled out the form explaining why he wanted to stay in the Soviet Union, he wrote that his dissatisfaction with the United States came from the tendency of American employers to hire a man and then fire him when he had learned the job. Soviet officials reviewed this and rejected it as a reason, noting that Webster had not personally experienced this. He rewrote the form. The Soviets accepted the revised version, and the process moved forward. On September 11, 1959, the same day, by a remarkable coincidence, that Lee Harvey Oswald was receiving his Marine Corps hardship discharge on the other side of the world, there was a small party for Webster to mark his formal transition. He was immediately flown to Leningrad with an interpreter, met by an in-tourist representative, and placed in work at the Leningrad Scientific Research Institute for polymerized plastics. He was housed in the Baltitskaya Hotel for the first month. On October 17, 1959, Webster was in Moscow for a meeting at the Central Visa and Registration Office. Present at the meeting were his RAND Development Supervisor, James H. Rand III, Rand's assistant, George Bookbinder, and American Embassy consular official Richard Snyder, the same Richard Snyder who would, 2 weeks later, sit across a desk from Lee Harvey Oswald as Oswald slapped his passport down and declared his allegiance to the Soviet Union. Webster told Snyder he was staying voluntarily, that he was free to speak, and that he had already been granted a Soviet internal passport dated September 21, 1959. He filled out an affidavit for an expatriated person and wrote his formal resignation letter to Rand Development. He left behind his wife and 2 children in the United States without resolving any financial arrangements for them. His Soviet girlfriend Vera joined him the following day. The 2 of them went on a month-long vacation at a sanitarium in Sochi, a resort city on the Black Sea. They returned to Leningrad, where Vera worked as his assistant and translator at the Institute. By December 1959, or January 1960, Webster turned over his American passport to Soviet authorities and received a Soviet internal passport in exchange. Then, in January 1960, a letter arrived from his father. The letter told him that his mother had suffered a nervous breakdown. It also told him that his father had assumed financial responsibility for Webster's 2 children, the ones Webster had left behind when he walked away from his life in Ohio. Webster read the letter and decided he wanted to go home. This decision came within roughly 3 months of his formal defection. He had barely settled into his Soviet life before the reality of what he had left behind broke through whatever it was that had driven him to leave. In May 1960, Webster contacted the American Embassy in Moscow and asked how to return to the United States. He was told he needed to apply for a Soviet exit visa. He applied. The application was rejected. Soviet exit visas were not automatic. Citizens and foreign nationals who had been granted Soviet residency were not free to simply leave when they changed their minds. The same system that had processed his arrival with relative speed now processed his departure with none at all. He was trapped. He reapplied a year later. In February 1962, the exit visa was finally granted. On May 20, 1962, 3 weeks before Lee Harvey Oswald arrived back in the United States from Minsk with his Soviet wife and infant daughter, Robert Webster landed back in America. He was classified as an alien on arrival. He had been gone approximately 2.5 years. He left behind Vera Platonova and the daughter he had fathered with her during his time in the Soviet Union. James H. Rand III, his former employer and the president of Rand Development, met him on his return and said publicly that he felt a responsibility for Webster and would help him find employment, though not at Rand. Webster appeared before a congressional committee to answer questions about his time in the Soviet Union. The hearing took place behind closed doors. The American intelligence community's interest in Webster went beyond the simple fact of his defection. Rand Development Corporation, his employer, had documented connections to American military and Air Force intelligence circles. Internal CIA memos obtained by the House Select Committee on Assassinations identified Webster as one of only 10 out of 117 known American defectors to the Soviet Union that the CIA admitted having contact with. Air Force intelligence had been involved in reviewing his security clearance in the months before his trip to Moscow. After his return, Webster was brought to Washington and debriefed by CIA officers and U.S. Air Force personnel for 2 weeks. What exactly Webster provided to Soviet scientists at the Leningrad Institute during his time there, beyond his knowledge of plastics manufacturing, was never made fully public. The Congressional Defector Study examined his case as part of its broader attempt to understand the pattern of American defections in the period surrounding Oswald's own defection. The timing was striking. Webster defected in September 1959. Oswald defected in October 1959. Webster returned in May 1962. Oswald returned in June 1962. Both were Navy veterans. Both had Soviet girlfriends suspected of KGB connections. Marina Oswald's address book was later found to contain an address for an apartment building where Webster had lived. When Oswald was arranging his own return to the United States from Minsk in 1961, he reportedly asked embassy officials about the fate of a young man named Webster who had come to the Soviet Union shortly before he did. Whether any of those connections added up to something coordinated has never been established. What is established is that two Americans, both with Navy backgrounds, both working in fields of interest to Soviet intelligence, defected to the Soviet Union within weeks of each other and returned within weeks of each other. American counterintelligence took that seriously enough to study it for years. Webster himself faded almost entirely from public view after his congressional testimony. He rebuilt a quiet life. He died in Fall River, Massachusetts on November 11, 1999. He is buried at Pine Grove Cemetery in New Bedford, Massachusetts. The daughter he left behind in the Soviet Union, the child he had with Vera Platonova during his time in Leningrad, grew up without him. There is no public record of whether he ever made contact with her. His case, stripped of all the intelligence analysis that surrounds it, is at its core a simple story. A man went to Moscow on a work assignment, met a woman, and chose her over everything else he had: his wife, his children, his country, his career, and his future. Within 3 months of making that choice, a letter from his father made him want it all back. He spent 2.5 years waiting for the Soviet state to let him leave. When he finally got home, the woman he had gone there for stayed behind. So did their daughter. The next 2 Americans to defect did it together, as a pair, and they did not do it for a woman. They did it because they had access to some of the most sensitive intelligence secrets in the United States government, and they had decided those secrets were dangerous enough to hand to the other side. Section 3. William Martin and Vernon Mitchell, the NSA men who told the world. William Hamilton Martin was born in 1931 in Columbus, Georgia. Vernon Ferguson Mitchell was born in 1929 in San Francisco, California. The two men met while serving in the United States Navy in Japan in the early 1950s. They were both mathematically gifted, both quiet and socially awkward by the accounts of people who knew them, and both drawn toward the kind of precise, analytical work that intelligence agencies prize. On the same day in 1957, they both joined the National Security Agency. The NSA in the late 1950s was the most secretive large organization in the American government. Its existence was barely acknowledged publicly. Its employees were not supposed to discuss where they worked. Its mission, intercepting and decoding the communications of foreign governments, including those of American allies, was classified at the highest levels. Martin and Mitchell worked as cryptologists, meaning they worked directly with the codes and signals that the agency collected from around the world. They knew things about American intelligence operations that very few people in the United States government knew. They also had serious doubts about what they were doing. Both men had become deeply alarmed by what they understood to be the American military's posture toward nuclear war. They had seen from the inside that the United States was conducting surveillance flights over Soviet territory, that it was spying on allied nations whose governments had no idea they were being monitored, and that senior American military figures were openly discussing the possibility of a nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. General Thomas Power, head of Strategic Air Command, had told a congressional committee that the United States needed to maintain the capability to strike first with nuclear weapons. Senator Barry Goldwater was publicly opposing nuclear test ban negotiations. To Martin and Mitchell, working inside the machine that gathered the intelligence that fed these calculations, the situation looked genuinely catastrophic. In December 1959, the two men traveled together to Cuba without notifying their NSA supervisors as required by agency procedures. This was a significant breach of protocol. Cuba, in December 1959, was 5 months into Fidel Castro's revolution, and visiting it without authorization was not the kind of thing an NSA cryptologist was supposed to do. The agency found out. Martin and Mitchell were called in and questioned about the trip. Nothing formal was done. They kept their jobs and their clearances. What NSA management did not know was that by this point, the two men had already decided to defect. The planning took months. They were careful and methodical, as people with their kind of training tend to be. They prepared a lengthy written statement laying out their reasons and their accusations. They gathered their thoughts about what they wanted to say publicly once they were on the other side. They did not recruit anyone else, did not tell any colleagues, and did not make contact with Soviet officials inside the United States. Their 1963 NSA internal report would later describe the defection as impulsive, which is a strange word for something that was clearly planned over a long period. But what the report likely meant was that no foreign intelligence service had recruited or directed them. They decided on their own, planned on their own, and executed on their own. On June 25, 1960, Martin and Mitchell left the United States. They flew to Mexico City. From Mexico City, they traveled to Havana, Cuba. From Havana, they boarded a Soviet freighter and sailed to the Soviet Union. Nobody stopped them. Nobody noticed they were gone. Immediately, because they had told the NSA they were taking vacation leave. On August 5, 1960, the Pentagon announced that the two men had not returned from vacation and stated that there was a likelihood that they had gone behind the Iron Curtain. The announcement was careful and understated, which was itself a sign of how serious the situation was. The NSA did not want to publicly confirm what these two men had access to, because confirming it would tell the Soviet Union exactly how much damage had been done. On September 6, 1960, Martin and Mitchell appeared together at a press conference at the House of Journalists in Moscow. They had asked for and been granted Soviet asylum and citizenship. The press conference was their public statement to the world, and they had written every word of it themselves, noting explicitly that they had done so without consulting the Soviet government. What they said at that press conference was extraordinary. They confirmed publicly for the first time that the NSA existed and described its mission. They stated that the United States had been conducting reconnaissance flights over foreign countries since at least 1952, well before the U-2 incident involving Francis Gary Powers had forced the Eisenhower administration to acknowledge the flights publicly in May 1960. They named specific operations. They described a U.S. Air Force C-130 flight over Soviet Armenia that Soviet forces had shot down, and stated that the flight was designed to gather intelligence on Soviet air defenses, meaning it was oriented toward understanding how to attack the Soviet Union rather than simply defend against it. They stated that the United States was intercepting the communications of its own allies, including West Germany, Turkey, Italy, and France, countries whose governments had no idea this was happening. They attacked the nuclear posture directly.
They described General Powers' congressional testimony about first strike capability and Goldwater's opposition to test ban treaties as evidence that the United States was moving toward nuclear war rather than away from it. They said,
"We would attempt to crawl to the moon if we thought it would lessen the threat of an atomic war." The press conference created an immediate international crisis. America's allies were furious about the surveillance revelations. The NSA was forced to begin damage assessment. Congressional hearings were called. The defection was described in a secret 1963 NSA internal study as the most damaging event in the agency's history, with the assessment that beyond any doubt, no other event has had or is likely to have in the future a greater impact on the agency's security program. The political response in Washington was swift and, in retrospect, revealing. Within days of the press conference, Congressman Francis E. Walter, chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee, announced that a source he trusted had told him Martin and Mitchell were sex deviates. The timing of this announcement, arriving within days of an internationally embarrassing defection that exposed illegal American surveillance of allied nations, was not coincidental. The charge immediately dominated the press coverage. Hearst newspapers called them two defecting black-mailed homosexual specialists and a love team. Time magazine reported that a review of security checks had turned up a Mitchell visit to a psychiatrist, presumably out of concern for homosexual tendencies. The substance of what the two men had revealed about American intelligence operations was buried under headlines about their personal lives. A Pentagon spokesman told reporters there was nothing in either man's personnel records to suggest homosexuality. The following day, Congressman Walter walked back his original statement, but the damage to the story's framing was done. The public conversation shifted from what Martin and Mitchell had revealed to who they were as people. The NSA's own subsequent investigation told a different story about their motivations. A 1961 NSA report described the two as close friends and somewhat antisocial, as egotistical, arrogant, and insecure young men whose place in society was much lower than they believed they deserved, and as men with greatly inflated opinions concerning their intellectual attainments. The 1963 report found no clear motive and concluded the defection had not been orchestrated by foreign recruitment. NSA files obtained by journalists at the Seattle Weekly in 2007 included testimony from women who had known Martin and Mitchell personally, attesting to their heterosexuality. The files also noted that the only recorded perversion was Martin's, what the NSA called, all-controlling sadomasochism, referring to his sexual preferences with female partners. Mitchell, when questioned early in his NSA employment, had told investigators he had experimented sexually as a teenager with animals. The NSA's immediate response to the defection focused heavily on purging what it called sexual deviates from the agency's workforce. In July 1961, the NSA announced it had removed 26 employees identified as sexual deviates, though it added that not all were homosexuals. What Galena Mitchell, Vernon Mitchell's eventual wife, said decades later about her husband's reasons was simpler than any of this. She said Mitchell and Martin were not communists. They chose the Soviet Union for two reasons: because Soviet women could work alongside men as equals in ways American women could not in that era, and because the Soviet Union had a serious chess culture. Mitchell, in particular, was an avid chess player, and the Soviet Union produced the best chess players in the world. Their lives in the Soviet Union were not what they had imagined. According to the NSA's own internal report, both men asked to leave the Soviet Union within a year of their defection. No country would accept them. They were stuck. Martin, who was fluent in Russian, studied at Leningrad University and used the Russian name Vladimir Sokolotsky. He married a Soviet woman, but divorced her in 1963. He would later tell a Russian newspaper that his defection had been foolhardy. Mitchell also married a Soviet citizen. His wife, Galina, became his widow when Mitchell died of a heart attack in November 2001 in St. Petersburg, where he was buried. He had spent 41 years in the Soviet Union and Russia. Martin had a different ending. In 1979, Mitchell attempted to emigrate to the United States with Galina. After the attempt became known, Galina was expelled from the Communist Party. The American government reviewed Mitchell's case and denied him entry. The visa was issued only to Galina, who refused to leave without her husband.
That left Martin as the one who eventually made it out, though only partially. He managed to reach Tijuana, Mexico, where he died in 1987. He had never made it back to the United States itself. The NSA's security overhaul following the defection was the most significant restructuring the agency had undertaken since its founding. Polygraph testing was expanded dramatically. Procedures for employees traveling abroad were tightened. The Cuba trip that Martin and Mitchell had taken without authorization in December 1959 became the central example used in training materials about what the new rules were designed to prevent. The agency's approach to internal security was permanently changed. At the National Security Council meeting in October 1960, officials tried to understand how two men with access to the most sensitive signals intelligence in the American government had walked out the door without being caught. Attorney General William Rogers suggested that the Soviets had a list of homosexuals they used for recruiting and blackmail, and that Martin and Mitchell had been part of an organized network. Several officials endorsed the idea that polygraph testing should be used specifically to screen out homosexual employees, on the theory that they were more vulnerable to blackmail and recruitment. This line of thinking drove personnel policy at multiple American intelligence agencies for years. The actual motive, as far as the documentary record shows, was not blackmail, not recruitment, and not ideology in the traditional sense. Two men who understood better than almost anyone in the United States what the nuclear standoff actually looked like from the inside had concluded that the people running it were going to get everyone killed, and they had decided to say so publicly, from Moscow, in a way that could not be suppressed or ignored. Whether that judgment was right or wrong, the cost of acting on it was total. They gave up their country, their careers, their families, their freedom to leave, and in Martin's case, decades of life in a system that turned out to have problems of its own that rivaled anything they had fled. The next American to defect had even deeper access to secret information than Martin and Mitchell, and he did not leave because of fear about nuclear war. He left because the country he had defected to was the only place in the world willing to take him in before the American government could figure out what he had already given away. Section 4. Victor Norris Hamilton, the codebreaker who vanished. Victor Norris Hamilton was not born with that name. He was born Fuzi Dimitri Hindali in Jaffa, in what was then the British Mandate of Palestine, in July 1919. He grew up speaking Arabic. He earned a degree from the American University of Beirut, one of the most respected universities in the Middle East, where instruction was conducted in English and the academic standards were serious. He was educated, multilingual, and intellectually capable in ways that would eventually make him valuable to the United States government and dangerous to it at the same time.
He met an American woman named Lily Bell Drake in Libya. She persuaded him to come to the United States with her. They married, and he changed his name from Hindley to Hamilton, taking a name that sounded less foreign and more compatible with the country he was trying to build a life in. He became a naturalized American citizen. He tried to find work as a teacher. He had the credentials for it, his university education, his language skills, his academic background. But he was an Arab in the American South during the early Cold War era, and he could not get hired. Schools turned him away. He ended up working as a doorman. Then a colonel found him. The specific details of how the National Security Agency recruited Hamilton are not fully documented in public records, but the broad outline is clear. The NSA in the mid-1950s was desperately short of Arabic speakers. The agency's mission included intercepting and analyzing the communications of Middle Eastern governments, and that required people who could actually read and understand Arabic at a high level. Hamilton could. He was recruited, vetted, and hired. He secured employment with the NSA in 1957 and went to work in what the agency called the ALLO unit, an abbreviation for All Other Countries, which was responsible for monitoring the coded communications of governments outside the main Cold War focus on the Soviet Union and China. His specific assignment was breaking the coded communications of Middle Eastern governments. This included communications between Arab nations and the Soviet Union regarding petroleum, meaning he had access to intelligence that sat at the intersection of Cold War geopolitics, Middle Eastern regional politics, and global energy supply. He also worked on communications involving Israel and other regional actors. The full scope of what he had access to was never publicly disclosed, but the NSA's reaction to his eventual defection made clear that it was substantial. Hamilton worked at the NSA for 2 years. In February 1959, he suffered what was recorded as a nervous breakdown. The agency kept him on despite this, because Arabic speakers with his level of skill were extremely difficult to find and replace. The NSA was willing to carry an employee with documented mental health problems rather than lose someone who could do the job. This decision would later look catastrophically short-sighted. In June 1959, the NSA finally discharged him. The official reason was mental health. Hamilton's own account of this was different. He later claimed that he had faked or exaggerated his symptoms, specifically so the agency would let him go. Whether this was true, or whether it was a retroactive explanation constructed to make his departure seem more deliberate and controlled than it actually was, nobody has been able to verify from the outside. What is verifiable is the sequence. He was hired. He worked for 2 years, he had a breakdown, or claimed to, and he was let go. He was out of the NSA by the summer of 1959. For the next 4 years, the public record of his life is thin. What is known is that by 1963, he had made contact with Soviet officials and arranged to defect to the Soviet Union. In July 1963, the Soviet government newspaper Izvestia published a lengthy account written by Hamilton describing his work at the NSA. The account went into specific detail about what the ALLO unit did, what communications it intercepted, and how the agency processed the intelligence it gathered from Middle Eastern governments. The publication of this account was the Soviet government's way of confirming he had arrived and demonstrating that he had brought useful information with him. For the NSA and American intelligence agencies, the Izvestia article was the first public confirmation that Hamilton had defected and was talking. The damage assessment was serious. Hamilton had worked on some of the most sensitive signals intelligence the United States had gathered in the Middle East during a period when the region was in constant political upheaval. The 1958 revolution in Iraq had just brought a new government to power. Tensions between Arab nationalist movements and Western-backed governments were running high. The intelligence Hamilton had worked with touched directly on how the United States and Soviet Union were maneuvering for influence across the entire region. Exactly what he told Soviet intelligence beyond what appeared in the Izvestia article has never been fully declassified. What happened to Hamilton inside the Soviet Union is one of the stranger stories in the entire history of American defectors. He was initially housed at a Kremlin hospital for high-ranking Soviet officials. This was a significant indicator of how seriously the Soviets initially valued him. The Kremlin hospital was not where ordinary people went. It was reserved for the Soviet elite and for high-value foreign assets. Being placed there meant the KGB considered Hamilton important enough to warrant that level of attention and, presumably, observation. But Hamilton's mental state was deteriorating, or had never been as stable as his NSA employment suggested, or both. He began showing symptoms of serious psychiatric illness. He became convinced that the Pentagon was communicating with him through his radio. Later, the radio was replaced by his television set as the medium through which he believed these communications were being sent. Whether this was genuine psychotic illness, whether it was something that developed under the pressures of his new life in the Soviet Union, or whether it was connected to whatever had caused his breakdown at the NSA in 1959, is impossible to determine from the available record. In 1971, 8 years after his defection, Soviet authorities transferred Hamilton from the Kremlin Hospital to Special Psychiatric Hospital No. 5, located in the town of Troitskoye, approximately 30 miles south of Moscow. Special psychiatric hospitals in the Soviet Union were not ordinary mental health facilities. They operated under KGB oversight and were used both for genuinely mentally ill patients and for political prisoners whom the Soviet state wanted to disappear without putting them through a public trial. The conditions in these facilities were documented by human rights investigators as harsh. Former patients described physical abuse, forced medication, and deliberate psychological mistreatment. Hamilton went into Special Psychiatric Hospital No. 5 in 1971. His family in the United States, his wife Lily and their daughters, last heard from him in 1973. After that, silence. They had no idea where he was. They had no idea if he was alive. For nearly 20 years, Victor Norris Hamilton simply did not exist as far as anyone outside the Soviet psychiatric system was concerned. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. In the chaos and relative openness of the post-Soviet period, an American nonprofit organization called the ARC Project began searching for American citizens who might be held in former Soviet facilities. The ARC Project was focused primarily on finding American prisoners of war and soldiers missing in action who might have ended up in Soviet hands during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. But their search was broad enough to catch other cases. In 1992, the ARC Project found Victor Norris Hamilton. He was at Special Psychiatric Hospital No. 5 in Troitskoye, where he had been for 21 years. He was 72 years old. He had been in that facility since 1971, and for the last 19 years, his family had not known he was alive. Susan Messenai, the leader of the ARC Project, visited him and reported back to American journalists. Hamilton appeared physically healthy, she said, but there was evidence he had been tortured. He was acting very, very paranoid. He had not recovered from, or had continued to develop,
whatever psychiatric condition had taken hold during his years in the Soviet system. He believed the Pentagon was still communicating with him through his television set. He was not the same man who had walked into the NSA in 1957, speaking multiple languages and breaking codes for the most secretive agency in the American government. His wife, Lily, 73 years old and living in an Atlanta suburb with one of their daughters, was contacted by journalists after the discovery. She said she thought she was going to pass out when she heard he had been found alive. She had last had contact with him in 1973, 19 years earlier. She said she wanted him back if the American government would not prosecute him for his defection and the secrets he had given to the Soviets. The question of prosecution was real. Hamilton had handed classified NSA intelligence to the Soviet government. Under American law, that was espionage. There was no statute of limitations on treason. The American government's response to his rediscovery was muted. There were no public announcements from the NSA or the State Department about what Hamilton had taken with him in 1963. There was no public statement about whether charges would be filed if he returned. His case landed in the news briefly in June 1992, when the initial reports of his discovery ran in American papers, and then it faded again. The post-Soviet landscape was full of urgent and complicated matters, and a 72-year-old, mentally ill former NSA analyst in a Moscow psychiatric hospital was not at the top of anyone's priority list. Hamilton was not brought back to the United States. He remained in Russia. In 1992, the same year he was rediscovered, Russian President Boris Yeltsin signed a decree granting him Russian citizenship. He died on November 11, 1997, in Russia. He was 78 years old. He had spent the last 34 years of his life in the country he had defected to. The last 26 of those years inside a psychiatric hospital. His case sits uncomfortably in the history of American defectors because it does not fit the standard narrative about why people chose the Soviet Union over the United States during the Cold War. He was not an ideological communist. He was not a spy recruited and directed by the KGB. He was not someone fleeing a personal scandal or a criminal charge. He was a Palestinian-born man who had become an American citizen, who had tried to build an academic career and been turned away, who had found his way into the most secretive part of the American government through the narrow door of his linguistic skills, who had a mental breakdown, or claimed to have one, and who defected to a country that initially put him in a hospital for senior officials, and then, 8 years later, transferred him to a facility where he would spend the rest of his life. The NSA has never publicly discussed what Hamilton took with him in any detail. The full damage assessment from his defection has not been declassified. What is known is that he had worked on the communications of every Middle Eastern government the NSA was monitoring in the late 1950s, that he had specific knowledge of how the agency processed and analyzed signals intelligence, and that he sat down with Izvestia in 1963 and described his work in enough detail that the newspaper published a lengthy account of it. Whatever the Soviets extracted from him in the months between his arrival and his transfer to the Kremlin hospital, they had time and motivation to be thorough. There is one more detail in his story that has no clean explanation. When Hamilton defected in 1963, he was a man who had been out of the NSA for 4 years. He had been discharged in 1959. The question that was never publicly answered was whether his knowledge remained current enough in 1963 to be useful to Soviet intelligence,
or whether the codes, procedures, and targets he had worked on had all been changed in the 4 years since he left. Intelligence agencies routinely changed their methods and codes after a security breach. The NSA would presumably have changed anything Hamilton had access to after his discharge in 1959, especially given that his breakdown and dismissal were themselves potential red flags. If that is the case, then what he provided in 1963 was 4-year-old intelligence about an agency that had been actively updating its methods since he left. The Soviets apparently found it worth taking him in regardless. Whether that judgment was based on what he actually knew in 1963, on what they hoped he knew, or on other calculations that have not been made public, the result was the same. He went in, and he did not come out for 29 years. And when he did, he was an old man in a psychiatric hospital who believed his television was sending him messages from the Pentagon. His wife, Lily, spent decades not knowing if her husband was alive. His daughters grew up without their father. The Ark Project found him almost by accident in a facility 30 miles south of Moscow, where he had been sitting for more than 2 decades while the Cold War he had defected into first intensified, then slowly unwound, and finally ended. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The NSA employee who defected next would not disappear quietly into a psychiatric hospital. He would disappear into the Soviet system in a very different way, arriving with a full public press conference, a new Russian name, a KGB rank, and a life that looked, from the outside, like everything a defector could have hoped for, right up until the moment he drove into his garage, closed the door, and started the engine. Section 5. Glenn Michael Souther, the spy who asked to be buried in a KGB uniform. Glenn Michael Souther was born on January 30, 1957, in Hammond, Indiana. His parents divorced when he was 4 years old, and he was raised by his mother. After graduating from high school in 1975 in Cumberland, Maine, he enlisted in the United States Navy and was trained as a photographer. He was good at it. The Navy sent him to photograph things that required a security clearance, and over time his assignments put him in proximity to information that went well beyond what a photographer would ordinarily need to see. From July 1976 to November 1978, he served aboard the USS Nimitz, one of the Navy's nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. From April 1979 to 1982, he was stationed with the United States Sixth Fleet in Italy, based out of Gaeta, aboard the USS Puget Sound. Italy was where everything changed. In 1980, while stationed in Italy, Souther walked into the Soviet embassy in Rome and asked to defect. He was 23 years old. He told Soviet officials he wanted political asylum and that he was not fleeing any persecution by American authorities. The KGB officer who received him was Boris Alexandrovich Solomatin, a senior and experienced intelligence officer who had previously recruited and handled John Anthony Walker, the Navy warrant officer who ran one of the most damaging spy networks in American history. Solomatin looked at Souther and made a calculation. He turned down the defection request. Instead, he recruited Souther to stay in place and spy. The logic was straightforward. A defector who walks in off the street has whatever he knows on the day he arrives, and that is all he will ever have. A spy who stays in place inside the Navy with an active security clearance and access to sensitive materials can keep producing intelligence indefinitely. Solomatin offered Souther Soviet citizenship as a future reward
in exchange for working as an agent inside the American military. According to Solomatin, who later discussed the recruitment publicly, Souther was an ideological spy. He was not doing it for money. Souther went back to work. He was photographing things the Navy needed photographed, and he was also photographing things the KGB needed photographed. His work at the 6th Fleet put him in contact with classified materials related to American naval operations, fleet movements, weapons systems, and strategic planning. He passed what he gathered to his Soviet handlers. He did this for years without being caught. In 1981, his estranged wife approached one of his superior officers and reported that she believed Souther was a spy. She had seen things, she said, that pointed in that direction. The report was filed. It was not acted on. The assessment at the time was that this was a scorned woman trying to cause trouble for a husband she was separating from. The report went into a file and sat there. In 1982, Souther received an honorable discharge from the Navy with the rank of Petty Officer First Class. He enrolled at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, to study Russian literature. This was not an unusual choice for someone with his apparent interests, but it was also not a choice that attracted no attention. Simultaneously with his studies, he went to work as a reservist at the Atlantic Fleet Intelligence Center in Norfolk, where he was assigned to a laboratory that processed satellite reconnaissance photographs. He may also have had access to sensitive communications intercepts. He was out of active service, but still inside the intelligence apparatus, still producing for his Soviet handlers, and studying the language and literature of the country he was working for. The 1981 report from his ex-wife sat in a file until 1985. That year, John Anthony Walker was arrested by the FBI. Walker was the spy Solomatin had recruited and run before Souther, the Navy warrant officer whose network had been selling cryptographic secrets to the Soviets for nearly 2 decades. Walker's arrest blew open a wide investigation into Soviet penetration of the American Navy. Investigators began reviewing old files. The 1981 report from Souther's ex-wife was pulled out and looked at again. This time, it was taken seriously. The FBI began investigating Souther. He was brought in for questioning. He was interrogated but not charged because the evidence at that point was not sufficient to support charges. However, the investigation was progressing, and Souther knew it. He could feel the net tightening. In May 1986, Souther formally requested Soviet citizenship. He knew the investigation was moving toward him, and he was not going to wait for an arrest. In June 1986, fearing that an arrest was imminent, he left the United States. He flew from America to Rome, where Soviet intelligence officers met him and arranged his transfer to Moscow. He had been spying for the Soviet Union for 6 years. He did not surface publicly for over 2 years. His disappearance was noted. He was listed as having gone absent, but his exact whereabouts were unknown to his family and to the American public. Soviet counterintelligence, in a pattern that had become familiar with arriving American defectors, was initially suspicious of him. They worried he might be a CIA plant, a double agent sent to penetrate the KGB under the cover of a defection. He was held and questioned and assessed before being cleared. Once they were satisfied he was genuine, they moved quickly to reward him. On October 2, 1986, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet issued a decree granting Southern Soviet citizenship. He was given a Russian name, Mikhail Yevgenyevich Orlov. He was provided with an apartment in Moscow and a dacha, a country house,
on the outskirts of the city. He was promoted to the rank of major in the KGB. This last honor was exceptional. Very few foreign defectors or agents were ever given actual officer rank inside the KGB. The agency reserved that for people it considered to have made contributions serious enough to warrant full inclusion in its professional structure. Souther was given the rank of major, which placed him inside the KGB as a commissioned officer, not just a handled asset. He was also awarded the Order of Friendship of Peoples, one of the significant state honors the Soviet government gave for contributions to Soviet development. The Soviet press, when it eventually covered his case, compared him to Kim Philby and George Blake, the British intelligence officers who had spied for the Soviet Union for decades and were celebrated in Soviet culture as heroes of the invisible front. What Souther had actually given the Soviets was significant. KGB chief Vladimir Khrushchev, speaking publicly after Souther's death, described him as one of Moscow's best operatives. Pravda reported that Souther had given the Soviets precious secrets, including detailed American plans in the event of nuclear war. The Washington Post reported that American defense and intelligence analysts were still trying to assess how much damage Souther had done. Among the materials he was believed to have provided were secret photographs of weapons systems, plans for the movement of fleet ships, their weapons loads and assigned tasks, and the criteria by which American military command assessed the conditions under which a nuclear strike would be permissible. Pravda also reported that Souther had access to American space intelligence. Satellite-gathered information about Soviet territory and military installations. In July 1988, more than 2 years after his defection, Souther appeared on Soviet Central Television in an interview. He spoke about his disillusionment with American nuclear policy and his admiration for the Russian poet Vladimir Mayakovsky, a towering and deeply melancholy literary figure who had shot himself in 1930 at the age of 36. Souther discussed his role in several American intelligence operations, including the 1986 American bombing of Libya and the analysis of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. He criticized American foreign policy at length. He appeared to be presenting the life he had chosen as one of purpose and meaning. But privately, by 1988, he was already in trouble. He married a Russian woman named Lena, who taught English at a Moscow university. They had a daughter together. He had a previous son from his marriage in Italy to an Italian woman. On paper, his Soviet life had the structure of stability: rank, recognition, apartment, family, dacha. But the reality of daily life in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s was grinding in ways that the ideology he had committed to had not prepared him for. Pravda, in its coverage after his death, acknowledged directly that what Souther found in the Soviet Union was not what he had dreamed about in the United States. He went shopping and could not find the things he needed. The Soviet economy in the late 1980s, even as Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika reforms were generating enormous public discussion about change, was struggling badly with shortages of basic consumer goods. A man who had grown up in America, even a man who had chosen the Soviet Union on principle, noticed when the shelves were empty. He also could not find his professional niche. In a television interview he gave during this period, he said plainly that there was a lot of work, but that he had not found his niche exactly, and that he did not feel he was being most productive for what he had to offer. He had given the Soviets 6 years of active espionage and a defection that they celebrated publicly. Now he was a major in an organization he could not fully function inside because he was not Russian, could not fully integrate because the culture was not his, and could not leave because there was nowhere to go. The United States wanted to prosecute him. He had a Soviet name, and a Soviet rank, and a Soviet apartment, and a Soviet family, and none of it was enough. Months before his death, he told Soviet television he was lonely. Pravda said he was a hypersensitive, troubled romantic. Izvestia described him as a great romantic who lived on his nerves. He was a passionate reader of Mayakovsky, and the parallel between the two men, a romantic who found reality insufficient and ended his own life, was noted in the Soviet press after the fact, perhaps more clearly than it had been noticed while he was still alive. On the evening of June 22, 1989, Souther drove to his dacha outside Moscow.
He wrote 4 suicide notes. One was addressed to his mother. One was to his Soviet wife, Lena. One was to their daughter. The 4th, and longest, was addressed to his colleagues at the KGB. Izvestia published extracts from the KGB letter. It read in part, "Justice demands that you hear my last words. I do not regret our relationships. They go back a long way, and they helped me grow as a person." He also wrote, "The second political thought that made me leave America and ask for Soviet citizenship is the fact that the United States treats other nations with contempt." He asked to be buried in the uniform of an officer of the KGB. After writing the notes, he went to the garage at his dacha. He started his Soviet-made Zhiguli car. He closed the garage door. He lay down on the back seat. Carbon monoxide filled the enclosed space. His colleagues, alarmed by his absence the following morning, went to the dacha and found him dead in the back seat of the car. The engine was still warm. He was 32 years old. KGB chief Vladimir Krichkov spoke to journalists within days of the death. He confirmed that Souther had committed suicide and gave the cause as psychological problems. He said Souther had long displayed a nervous state of mind, that he was very gifted and easily hurt, and that the KGB could not blame anyone for his death. The motive, Krichkov said, was not political. Souther was buried on Monday, June 26, 1989, in the military section of Kuntsevo Cemetery in western Moscow, not far from the grave of Kim Philby, the British spy and KGB general who had died in 1988. He was buried in his KGB uniform, as he had requested. The funeral was attended by his mother and other relatives from the United States, who flew to Moscow for the burial and returned home afterward. The Soviet press spent the following week lionizing him. Pravda ran a long profile, calling him a figure in the line of Philby and Blake. The Communist Party newspaper said Souther had done everything to help the forces on the side of peace, and that such men created conditions so that the atom bombs did not fall on Soviet cities. Izvestia ran a profile calling him a great romantic whose nerves had simply failed under the pressure of his extraordinary life. He was photographed in Pravda, walking Moscow streets and talking with children, presented as half spy, half symbol. In Washington, defense and intelligence analysts were more focused on the damage. Krichkov himself had confirmed publicly that Souther worked for the KGB for a number of years while serving in the Navy, that he had gone on to become one of Moscow's best operatives, and that he had made a major contribution to the national security of the Soviet Union. This was the KGB chief speaking on the record. The Americans could not dispute it because, to dispute it, they would have had to confirm what had been taken, which they could not do publicly. The 1981 report from Souther's ex-wife, the one that sat in a file for 4 years before Walker's arrest made investigators look at it again, became a case study in what happens when an early warning is dismissed. She had gone to a superior officer in 1981. She had reported what she believed she had seen. The report had been assessed as personal grievance and filed away.
By the time the FBI finally took it seriously in 1985, Souther had been spying for 5 years and had one more year of access before he fled. The report sitting in that file for 4 years was not a minor administrative failure. It was 4 additional years of damage. Souther's case was used inside American intelligence as an example of what ideological recruitment looked like when it was not motivated by money. Sola Martin had said it explicitly. Souther was not doing it for payment. He believed in what he was doing. That made him, in some ways, more dangerous than a spy who could be identified by unusual financial activity, unexplained deposits, new possessions, a lifestyle that did not match his salary. Souther's lifestyle did not change dramatically after his recruitment. He was not buying houses or cars or expensive watches. He was a believer, and believers are harder to find. He was also, by the end, a man who had found that belief was not enough to make the life he had chosen livable. He had given everything: his country, his Navy career, his American family, eventually his freedom to go anywhere, to a system that acknowledged his sacrifice, gave him a rank and an apartment and a dacha and a state award, and still could not give him what he had apparently needed, which was a place where he fully belonged. He was buried with full military honors as a major in the KGB. His mother came from the United States to watch them put him in the ground. 4. The next American to defect made it out of the United States in a way that became legendary inside intelligence circles, not because of what he knew, but because of how he ran, using a trick that the CIA had literally trained him to use, against the very agency that had taught it to him. Section 6. Edward Lee Howard, the CIA man who used their own tricks to escape. Edward Lee Victor Howard was born on October 27, 1951, in New Mexico. He grew up in the state, attended schools there, and built an early adult life that looked, on paper, like exactly the kind of background the CIA looks for when it recruits case officers. He was a Boy Scout. He was an altar boy. He joined the Peace Corps after college and served in Bucaramanga, Colombia. He was trilingual. He traveled. He earned a master's degree in business administration from American University in Washington, D.C. in 1976. He worked for USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, spending 2 years in Lima, Peru, on loan projects. He held a top-secret security clearance from his government work before the CIA ever looked at him. The CIA hired him in 1980. He was 28 years old, married to a woman named Mary Cedarleaf, whom he had met in the Peace Corps, and by every external measure, an ideal candidate. Both Edward and Mary were put through CIA training. The agency was preparing them as a husband and wife team to be deployed together to Moscow Station, one of the most sensitive and demanding postings in the entire intelligence world. To prepare Howard for Moscow, the CIA gave him access to the details of its Soviet operations. He learned the names of Soviet citizens who were working as CIA agents inside the USSR. He learned the locations of safe houses. He learned recruitment techniques and the methods the agency used to communicate with its assets in Moscow without being detected by the KGB. He was being handed the blueprint of American intelligence operations in the Soviet Union because he was supposed to go there and run them. He never went. In June 1983, 7 months before his 3-year probationary period at the CIA was complete, Howard was fired. The agency said he had failed multiple polygraph tests. The tests indicated deception on questions about past drug use and the theft of small amounts of money from the agency. Howard maintained for the rest of his life that the accusations were exaggerated or fabricated, and that he was being made a scapegoat. Whatever the truth of the specific accusations, the outcome was concrete. He was fired, his Moscow posting was canceled, and he was cut off from the CIA with a head full of knowledge about its most sensitive operations in the Soviet Union and no outlet for any of it. The firing broke something in him. He and Mary moved back to New Mexico, where he had grown up. The CIA, apparently feeling some obligation toward a man they had trained extensively and then dismissed, helped him get a job as an economic analyst with the New Mexico state government. But Howard was struggling. He drank heavily. In February 1984, a drunken brawl resulted in his arrest for assault with a deadly weapon. The charges were later reduced to aggravated assault. He was now a felon, fired from the CIA, working a state government job in Santa Fe, drinking too much, and sitting with knowledge that the most powerful intelligence agency in the world had decided he was no longer trustworthy enough to use. In October 1983, according to later FBI sources, Howard drove to the area outside the Soviet embassy in Washington and sat there, thinking about going in. He did not go in that day, but the thought had formed and it did not go away. In July 1984, he may have met with Soviet officials in Juarez, Mexico, across the border from El Paso. In September 1984, he traveled to Vienna, Austria on vacation with Mary. American intelligence later concluded that in Vienna, he met with KGB officers and agreed to an espionage arrangement, receiving payment for classified information. He reportedly made a deposit into a Swiss bank account. After the Vienna trip, friends in New Mexico noticed he had acquired a collection of Swiss gold coins, a Rolex watch, and Russian-style hats that he and his young son modeled for photographs. These were not the purchases of a man living on a New Mexico state government salary. In early 1985, he made contact with Soviet agents again, reportedly in a second meeting in Vienna. The Moscow leaks continued. CIA assets inside the Soviet Union were being identified and arrested. A valued CIA source named Adolf Tolkachev, a Soviet defense researcher who had been providing the Americans with detailed information about Soviet military technology for years, and who was known inside the CIA as the billion-dollar spy for the value of what he provided, was arrested by the KGB and later executed. American intelligence officials believed Howard's information had led to Tolkachev's exposure. Several other CIA operations in Moscow collapsed during this same period. The CIA's network inside the Soviet Union was being rolled up systematically, and Howard was the explanation they reached for first. What they did not know, and would not know for nearly a decade, was that another CIA officer named Aldrich Ames had also begun selling the names of CIA assets to the Soviets in April 1985. Many of the losses that were attributed to Howard were actually caused by Ames. The two men's espionage overlapped in time, and since Howard was the one who fled, and Ames stayed in place and kept his cover for another 9 years, Howard became the public face of the damage, while Ames continued causing it invisibly. The identification of Howard as a potential mole came from a Soviet defector. On August 1, 1985, a KGB colonel named Vitaly Yurchenko walked into the American embassy in Rome and defected to the United States. During his debriefing, Yurchenko told CIA officers that the KGB had an asset inside American intelligence. A former CIA officer who had been slated for Moscow, but had been removed from the posting. He had never met this asset personally. He did not know the man's name, but the description matched Edward Lee Howard precisely. Yurchenko's debriefer, assigned to handle him and extract every piece of information he carried, was Aldrich Ames, the man who was himself spying for the Soviets. Ames immediately reported back to Moscow that Yurchenko had identified Howard, which allowed the KGB to confirm to Howard that his name was about to come up. The FBI opened a full investigation of Howard. By early September 1985, they had placed his Santa Fe home under surveillance. They were watching his car, monitoring his movements, and preparing to intercept his phone communications. On September 19, 1985, FBI agents arranged a meeting with Howard at a hotel in Santa Fe.
They told him he was under investigation for espionage contacts with the KGB. They asked if he would take a polygraph test. He became hostile. He said he wanted a lawyer. A meeting was scheduled for the following week. Howard did not wait for the following week. On the evening of September 21, 1985, Howard and Mary went out to dinner. The FBI knew about the dinner. Surveillance agents were covering the house, but the desert terrain around the property made close observation difficult, and the agent working the surveillance position that night had been briefed for only 45 minutes before taking the post. When Howard and Mary drove away, the surveillance team followed at a distance. At some point during the drive home, as Mary slowed to negotiate a curve in the road, Howard opened the passenger door and rolled out of the moving car into the New Mexico desert. He had prepared a dummy for this moment. Stuffed clothing and a wig stand, dressed to look like a person sitting in the passenger seat, wearing a Calvin Klein field jacket, a wig, and a baseball cap. As Howard disappeared into the darkness, Mary reached over and positioned the dummy in his seat. From a surveillance distance in the dark, it looked like Howard was still in the car. Mary drove home. When she got back to the house, the appearance from outside was that both of them had returned from dinner. This technique was not something Howard invented.
It was a standard CIA counter-surveillance method, taught at the agency's training facility known as the Farm. The CIA called it a jack-in-the-box. Howard had been trained in it during his preparation for the Moscow posting. He used it to escape from the FBI agents who were trying to catch him with the same trick the CIA had spent months teaching him. By the time the FBI realized Howard was not in the house, he was already gone. He made his way to Albuquerque, where he boarded a flight to New York City using his TWA getaway card, a frequent flyer account registered in his real name, which he apparently calculated the FBI would not be watching yet. From New York, he flew to Helsinki, Finland. In Helsinki, he went to the Soviet embassy and asked for asylum. The KGB transferred him to Moscow. He had been under FBI surveillance for less than 2 weeks between the moment Yurchenko identified him and the moment he disappeared. Mary Howard was never prosecuted. Her role in the escape, positioning the dummy, driving home, maintaining the appearance that nothing unusual had happened, was investigated, but no charges were filed. She eventually moved back to the United States with their son Lee and continued to visit Howard in Moscow on an annual basis. Howard surfaced in Moscow in 1986, when the Soviet government confirmed he had been granted political asylum. He was the first person known to have worked as a CIA case officer ever to defect to the Soviet Union. The KGB gave him an apartment on Syevtsev-Vrajek Street in central Moscow and a dacha in Zhukovka, an exclusive suburb west of the city where senior Soviet military officials, scientists, and KGB officers kept country homes. 2 guards were assigned to the dacha round the clock, both to protect Howard from potential CIA abduction or assassination and to ensure he did not go anywhere the KGB had not authorized. He lived under these conditions for 5 years. The KGB paid him a salary. His knowledge of CIA operations in Moscow was extracted through sustained debriefing. American intelligence officials estimated that the damage from what Howard knew was severe, though as the Ames case later demonstrated, some of what was attributed to Howard had actually been caused by Ames. Howard maintained throughout his life that he had never provided information that could hurt America or Americans, a claim that the public record did not support. In 1991, Howard's chief protector inside the KGB, Vladimir Kryuchkov, was arrested and charged with treason for his role in the failed August coup against Mikhail Gorbachev. With Kryuchkov gone and the Soviet Union itself collapsing, Howard's position in Moscow became precarious. He worried that the new Russian government, desperate for American economic assistance and goodwill, might hand him over to the United States as a gesture of cooperation. He left Russia and lived briefly in Sweden. In Sweden in 1992, he was arrested by Swedish counterintelligence. He called the journalist David Wise, who had written a book about his case, from the Stockholm jail. Wise, who had interviewed Howard previously in Budapest and Moscow, took the call. Howard sounded perfectly cheerful, Wise later reported. Within hours, the charges were dropped. There was no evidence Howard had spied in Sweden, and the Swedish government made clear he was not welcome to stay. He was put on a plane back to Moscow. He spent the remainder of his life in the Zhukovka area outside Moscow. His KGB protection was reduced after Kryuchkov's fall. A Washington Times report in the early 1990s noted that Howard had lost his round-the-clock KGB security and was worried he might be turned over to American authorities for prosecution. He set up a trade consulting business and tried to build a legitimate professional life in post-Soviet Russia. He traveled, using various identities, to France, Canada, Mexico, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Eastern Europe. In 1995, he published a memoir called Safe House through National Press Books, in which he indicated he was open to a plea bargain with the United States government. He maintained his innocence on the core espionage charges. No plea arrangement was ever reached. On July 12, 2002, Howard died at his home in Zhukovka. He was 50 years old. Igor Prelin, an official with an association of retired Soviet foreign intelligence officers who had known Howard since 1988, confirmed the death. David Wise, who had followed Howard's case for years and conducted multiple interviews with him, reported that Howard had died from a fall down a flight of stairs. Prelin said he did not know the cause of death. There was no official American government statement. He was cremated. His wife, Mary, who had never been prosecuted for her role in his escape and had maintained contact with him throughout the 17 years he lived in Moscow, was not publicly quoted in coverage of his death. Their son, Lee, who had visited his father in Russia annually while growing up in Minnesota with his mother, had by then reached his 20s. The FBI had been waiting to prosecute Howard for 17 years when he died. The espionage charges were never formally resolved. He died as a fugitive, technically, though one who had lived openly under his own name in Moscow for nearly 2 decades, published a memoir, given interviews to journalists, and traveled internationally without being apprehended. What Howard represented inside the American intelligence community was a specific and disturbing kind of failure. He was not recruited by the KGB. He was not approached by a foreign intelligence service while he was working at the CIA. He was trained, given access to the crown jewels of American intelligence operations in the Soviet Union, then fired and left to sit with that knowledge and no loyalty to the institution that had discarded him. The path from firing to Vienna to Moscow was not inevitable, but it was not incomprehensible either. A man trained to run intelligence operations, who had been given access to sensitive information and then told he was not trustworthy enough to use it, found another buyer. The CIA changed its personnel procedures after Howard. The specific vulnerability he exposed, that a fired employee could retain complete knowledge of sensitive, ongoing operations, led to immediate changes in how the agency handled dismissals of personnel with access to classified operational details. Those changes came after the damage was done. Howard was 50 years old when he died, in the suburb outside Moscow where senior Soviet officials had kept their dachas, 17 years after rolling out of a car in the New Mexico desert using a trick his own agency had taught him. __quote _5 __. The next American to defect was not a spy, not a soldier, not an intelligence officer. He was a cancer researcher from Houston who packed his family into a Chevrolet one Sunday afternoon and drove to the airport, leaving his garbage on the curb for Monday morning pickup, as though he would be back to collect it. Section 7. Arnold Lokshin, the scientist who took his children with him. Arnold Lokshin was born on February 3, 1939, in San Francisco. He was a serious student. He earned his master's degree and then his doctorate in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1963 and 1966, studying under Robert Burris, an eminent biochemist who would later receive the National Medal of Science from President Carter and the Wolf Prize in Agriculture, an award sometimes called the Nobel Prize of Agriculture. Burris remembered Lokshin as a productive and capable scientist. He also remembered, decades later, that Lokshin had very definite leanings toward red causes ever since he was a graduate student. This was not a secret Lokshin kept especially carefully. While at Harvard University in 1966, he served as National Secretary for the Anti-HUAC organization, a group that opposed the House Un-American Activities Committee. At one point, he worked as a full-time recruiter for the Communist Party in Cleveland. His wife, Lauren, grew up in Miami. The two of them met at Berkeley, where they participated in student demonstrations in the 1960s and openly embraced communist politics. They were not casual sympathizers. From 1970 until at least 1973, former party members later told the Los Angeles Times, Arnold Lokshin was second in command of the Southern California district of the United States Communist Party. Both Arnold and Lauren were described by those former members as extremely dogmatic on party issues. They believed what they believed without much room for doubt or revision. From 1977 to 1980, Lokshin worked in Los Angeles doing research into anti-cancer drugs for the Los Angeles County University of Southern California Cancer Research Center. In 1980, the family moved to Houston, Texas. Lokshin took a position as a pharmacologist at the Stalin Foundation for Cancer Research, associated with St. Joseph Hospital. He headed the cancer research laboratory there. His salary was more than $50,000 a year, which in 1980 was a comfortable professional income. They bought a 4-bedroom house in the Meyerland area of Houston, a middle-class suburban neighborhood. Lauren worked as an independent marketing consultant. They had 3 children: Jennifer, their oldest, born around 1971, Jeffrey, born around 1974, and Michael, the youngest, born around 1980. From the outside, the Lokshins looked like what they were on paper: a professional family with a good income, a nice house, children in local schools, and a quiet suburban life in a major American city. What they also were, simultaneously, was an active communist family in the heart of Reagan's America, in the most politically conservative decade the country had experienced since the 1950s.
in a city built on the oil industry and deeply aligned with the Republican politics of the era. Lokshin published scientific papers throughout his time at the Stalin Foundation. His curriculum vitae, by the time of his departure, listed 14 publications in professional journals since 1980, 6 of them co-authored by Dr. John Stalin himself, the scientific director of the foundation. Robert Burris, his doctoral supervisor from Wisconsin, reviewed Lokshin's record and said flatly that charges of incompetence were ridiculous. He was, Burris said, a productive and competent scientist. The Foundation saw it differently. In August 1986, Lokshin returned from a trip to find his experimental materials had been destroyed. He was informed that his last day at the Stalin Foundation would be September 30th, 1986. He was given no coherent explanation for the dismissal, and he wrote to Burris saying he had to assume it was because of his political beliefs. Dr. John Stalin said publicly and repeatedly that the firing had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with job performance, that Lokshin's work had deteriorated in the months before his dismissal, that the quality had declined, and that the decision was scientific, period. The question of which account was accurate, persecution for politics or dismissal for performance, was never resolved in any formal proceeding because Lokshin left the country before any such process could occur. What is documented on both sides is this: a scientist with a 14-publication record over 6 years was fired from his job in August 1986, 6 weeks before he defected, and the reason given by his employer and the reason he gave himself were completely different. Lokshin told Burris in his letter that he had returned from a trip to find his materials destroyed and was then told he was done. Burris, a man with no particular reason to take sides in a Cold War defection, told journalists that Lokshin's credentials as a researcher clearly qualified him to work in one of Russia's scientific laboratories. Stalin's foundation, for its part, had 6 joint publications with Lokshin in its own records at the moment it was calling his work inadequate. These facts sit side by side in the documentary record without resolving into a clean answer. What happened next resolved very cleanly. On a Sunday in October 1986, Arnold Lokshin received what was described by journalists who later investigated the case as a communiqué from overseas that he had been waiting for. The exact nature of this communication was never publicly detailed. What is known is that on that Sunday, having received whatever signal he was waiting for, Lokshin calmly walked out of his house, wheeled the garbage from his carport, and left it on the curb for Monday morning pickup, as if it were a normal weekend and he would be home to start a normal week. He then went back inside and told his wife and 3 children to pack their bags. The family of 5 got into their Chevrolet. They left behind most of their possessions, the furniture, the household goods, the accumulated material of a life built over 6 years in that house. They drove to Houston Intercontinental Airport. They were traveling under assumed names. They boarded a flight to Washington, D.C., connected to a flight to Moscow, and landed in the Soviet Union. Jennifer was 15 years old. Jeffrey was 11. Michael was 5 or 6 years old, depending on the exact date of travel relative to his birthday. These were not adults making an informed choice about the political system they wanted to live under. They were children being taken by their parents from the only country they had ever known to a country they had never been to, whose language they did not speak, in the middle of a school year. The Soviet government had been expecting them. The timing of the Lokshin defection was not accidental. It came just days before the Reykjavik summit between President Ronald Reagan
and Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, one of the most significant diplomatic meetings of the Cold War, at which the two leaders came closer to a comprehensive nuclear arms reduction agreement than any American and Soviet leader ever had. The Soviets understood the propaganda value of an American family choosing the Soviet Union at the exact moment when the American president was about to sit down with the Soviet leader. Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze gave a public statement about the Lakshans that framed their arrival in precisely these terms. Just as Soviet dissidents had sought asylum in the United States, so an American family had found a haven in Soviet Russia. He did not note that Soviet citizens who sought refuge in America were doing so in numbers that dwarfed the handful of Americans who ever moved in the other direction. The Soviet news agency TASS arranged press conferences. Lakshin appeared on Soviet radio and television. He told Soviet audiences that he had been fired because of his socialist views. He stated that his family had been harassed by shadowy government operatives. His phone tapped, his mail opened, his children threatened, his son subjected to peer pressure from classmates enlisted by government forces. He described a systematic campaign of FBI persecution designed to drive him out of his career and out of his country. The United States government denied everything.
A State Department spokesman named Pete Martinez said Lakshin and his family were still American citizens, that Lakshin was welcome to travel back to the United States whenever he chose, and that the statements attributed to him in Soviet media did not accurately reflect the situation as the American government understood it. Former party members in California, interviewed by the Los Angeles Times within days of the defection becoming public, placed Lakshin's communist credentials in plain sight. He had been second in command of the Southern California district of the party for years. He had been a full-time party recruiter. He had been openly and consistently communist for his entire adult life. Yet, at his Moscow press conferences, he denied being a communist, while acknowledging he had been a Communist Party organizer, a distinction that journalists covering the story found difficult to parse. The Soviets installed the family in a Moscow apartment. It was smaller than the four-bedroom Houston house, significantly smaller. Lauren Lakshin gave up her consulting work and became a full-time homekeeper. Arnold Lakshin took the Moscow subway each day to his job at the All-Union Cancer Research Center, the Soviet equivalent of the institution he had left in Houston. He was earning a Soviet researcher's salary, which was a fraction of the $50,000 annual income he had walked away from. They had no car. Their possessions fit in the apartment. 6 months after the defection, a reporter from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram had dinner with the Lakshins at a Moscow restaurant, accompanied by an employee of the Soviet news agency Novosti. Arnold Lakshin said they were happy. He said the average Soviet working person was no different from the average working American. He said it was not like moving to another planet. He said there was less fear in Moscow than in Houston, where he described hunger and poverty in the Third Ward. Lauren said she missed reruns of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Arnold said he missed country music, particularly George Strait. He could not explain, or chose not to explain, why a man who missed George Strait and Mary Tyler Moore had decided that the Soviet Union was preferable to the country that produced them. The children adapted, with the particular resilience that children sometimes demonstrate when adults give them no choice. Jennifer, 15 when she arrived, was within a year reportedly spending an hour each evening on the phone with friends she had made in Moscow. Jeffrey and Michael attended Soviet schools and built lives there. In 1992, as the Soviet Union was in its final collapse, and Russia was reinventing itself under Boris Yeltsin, a journalist from Texas Monthly named Jan Jarbo Russell traveled to Moscow to interview Lakshin.
She was repeatedly rebuffed by what she described as his surly receptionist. When she finally managed to reach him, the interview she conducted left her with a picture of a man still committed to his political views, but unable to articulate what those views had produced for him or his family. She wrote in the resulting article that the view of the world Lokshin held on to was not only irrelevant, but banal, that he was a Cold War leftover who had imagined himself heroic and romantic, and that the events of 1989 in Eastern Europe and 1991 in the Soviet Union had rendered his entire framework obsolete. In 1992, Russian President Boris Yeltsin signed a decree granting Arnold Lokshin Russian citizenship. He continued working at the Blokhin Oncological Scientific Center in Moscow as a research biologist until the late 1990s. At some point after his move to the Soviet Union, he and Lauren separated. The Houston Press, which investigated the family's history in a detailed 2008 report, noted that Arnold Lokshin later wrote a letter complaining that the American government was denying him his Social Security benefits, on the grounds that he had paid into the system for his entire working life and that neither the Soviet Union nor Russia had ever been at war with the United States, so there was no legal basis for withholding his American state pension. He did not appear to find any irony in the argument that the American government owed him benefits after he had defected from it. Michael Lokshin, the 5-year-old who had been buckled into the family Chevrolet on that Sunday in October 1986, grew up to become a Russian film director. He directed the 2024 Russian film adaptation of Mikhail Bulgakov's novel The Master and Margarita, one of the most celebrated works of Soviet-era literature, a film that was simultaneously critically acclaimed and politically controversial in Russia. His sister Jennifer works at the State University Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Of Jeffrey, the middle child who was 11 years old on the day his father wheeled the garbage to the curb and changed all their lives, the public record says almost nothing. Arnold Lokshin appeared on Russian television in July 2013 to speak in support of political asylum for Edward Snowden, the NSA contractor who had leaked classified surveillance information and was stranded at Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow. He was 74 years old. He had been in Russia for 27 years. He was defending the Soviet Union's successor state's decision to take in another American who said he had been persecuted for exposing the truth about his government. His current whereabouts are unknown. The Houston Press reporter who covered his case received a brief note from Michael Lokshin at one point, reading something to the effect of, "You found me, now catch me if you can." Written without malice, but with the clear message that the family was not interested in further contact. Arnold Lokshin himself sent one email to the reporter, complaining about the Social Security situation, and did not reply to the response. What the Lokshin case adds to the history of Americans who defected to the Soviet Union is something that the other cases do not contain: children. Oswald went alone and later brought a Soviet wife back with him. Webster left his American children behind. Martin and Mitchell were single men. Hamilton's family stayed in the United States. Howard's wife helped him escape but stayed in America herself. Souther left an Italian ex-wife and a son in Italy and a Russian wife and daughter in Moscow. Lokshin took his 3 children with him. Jennifer was 15. Jeffrey was 11. Michael was 5 or 6. They had no vote in the matter. Their father had decided, and they went. They grew up in Moscow, learned Russian, built Russian lives. 2 of them appear to still be there. One of them makes films. None of them, as far as the public record shows, has ever publicly expressed regret about a decision that was made for them on a Sunday afternoon in Houston when their father put the garbage on the curb and told them to pack. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The last American in this series did not defect because of ideology or love or fear of prosecution or disillusionment with capitalism. He defected because of a woman he met in Moscow, and the decision he made trying to stay with her cost him nearly 3 years of his life and a daughter he never went back for.
Section 8. Wade Evan Roberts, the private who defected in 8 months and wanted out. Wade Evan Roberts was born in San Bernardino, California. He was 22 years old in early 1987, which means he was born around 1964 or 1965. He was a private second class in the United States Army, one of the lowest enlisted ranks, assigned to Bravo Battery, 3rd Battalion, 79th Field Artillery, 42nd Field Artillery Brigade, based in Gießen, West Germany, a city roughly 30 miles north of Frankfurt. He was not an intelligence officer. He did not have access to classified programs or cryptographic secrets. He was not a code breaker or a case officer or a Navy photographer processing satellite reconnaissance photographs. He was a young private doing field artillery work in a NATO base in West Germany during the final decade of the Cold War. On March 2, 1987, Roberts went absent without leave from his base in Gießen. The Army listed him as a deserter. At the same time, he and a West German woman named P. Neumann, described in Soviet Foreign Ministry statements as his girlfriend, made their way to the Soviet Union. On April 2, 1987, Soviet Foreign Ministry spokesman Gennady Gerasimov held a press conference and announced that the Supreme Soviet, the legislative body of the Soviet state, had granted political asylum to an American named W.E. Roberts and a woman named P. Neumann, and that the two had settled in Turkmenia, a Soviet republic bordering Iran and Afghanistan in Central Asia. Gerasimov was characteristically dry in the way senior Soviet spokesmen often were when they had a piece of propaganda to deliver without appearing to enjoy it too much. He said Roberts and Neumann had justified fears that they would be victimized in the West for their progressive views, and that Roberts had already been subjected to persecution in the United States Army. He also said, apparently unable to resist entirely, that the couple had chosen Turkmenia as their honeymoon destination, and that Roberts had decided to go there to hunt for snakes. The snake hunting line made it into multiple wire service reports because it was the kind of detail that did not sound like it had been written by a Foreign Ministry communications team. The American response was careful. The Pentagon said it could not positively link Private Roberts with the Roberts that the Soviet Foreign Ministry was describing, though the details, name, rank, unit, date of going AWOL, aligned closely enough that the hedge was largely procedural. The Army confirmed that Private 2 Wade Evan Roberts of San Bernardino had gone absent without leave from his Gießen base on March 2, 1987, and was officially classified as a deserter. The Army did not confirm the defection publicly, but it did not deny the identity match either. The Soviet announcement noted that this was the second case of an American asking for asylum in Moscow since CIA officer Edward Lee Howard had defected in August 1985. In the intervening period, the Arnold Lokshin family had also arrived in October 1986. The Soviets were keeping count, and they were using each case as a data point in a broader public argument that the United States was not the free and open society it claimed to be. Roberts was a different kind of defector from every American who had come before him in this account. He was not bringing NSA cryptographic secrets. He was not handing over CIA operational details or satellite reconnaissance photographs or nuclear war contingency plans. He was a 22-year-old private in an artillery unit who had gone AWOL with his girlfriend and ended up in Soviet Central Asia. The Soviets granted him asylum and used his arrival as a propaganda moment, but there was no intelligence value in what Roberts could offer.
He was a low-ranking enlisted soldier with no special access. What he did have was a grievance against the army. The Soviet Foreign Ministry's statement used the phrase persecution in the United States Army, which was the language Roberts himself provided to Soviet officials. The specific nature of this persecution was never detailed publicly by either Roberts or Soviet authorities. American military records from the period do not shed light on what, if anything, had occurred in Roberts's service that he experienced as persecution. He was assigned to a field artillery unit. He went AWOL, and he ended up in the Soviet Union. The why, beyond the West German girlfriend and whatever he had told Soviet officials, was not documented in a way that reached the public record. The couple was settled in Turkmenia, which in 1987 was one of the most remote and isolated of the Soviet republics. Turkmenia, today the independent nation of Turkmenistan, bordered Iran to the south, Afghanistan to the southeast, and the Caspian Sea to the west. Its capital was Ashgabat. It was not Moscow. It was not Leningrad. It was not one of the Soviet Union's major cultural or scientific centers. It was a Central Asian republic with a predominantly Muslim population, a desert climate, and an economy built around cotton and natural gas. For two young people from West Germany and California, it was about as far from either place as it was possible to get while remaining within Soviet borders. Within months, the distance, geographic, cultural, linguistic, everything, had done its work. By October 1987, less than 8 months after his defection, Roberts was living not in Turkmenia, but in a Moscow hotel. He was with his West German girlfriend, and he was, in the word used by the Washington Post reporter who covered his situation that month, disillusioned. He was country hunting, the same reporter wrote, meaning Roberts was actively trying to find a third country that would accept him. He did not want to go back to the United States because he was facing desertion charges. He did not want to stay in the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union had turned out to be nothing like whatever he had imagined it would be. He was 22 or 23 years old, stuck in a Moscow hotel with his girlfriend, having burned his American life and found the alternative wanting, looking for a door that might open somewhere else. The speed of his disillusionment was striking even by the standards of American defectors, most of whom lasted longer before acknowledging how badly the decision had gone. Lee Harvey Oswald lasted nearly 3 years before he started writing to the American embassy asking how to get home. Robert Webster lasted 3 months before the letter from his father broke through. Martin and Mitchell lasted about a year before both of them asked to leave. Roberts lasted 8 months before he was openly describing himself as country hunting from a Moscow hotel room. What the Soviet Union had offered Roberts was asylum, relocation to Turkmenia, and the propaganda value of his press conference appearance. What it had not offered was anything that made life in the Soviet Union livable for a young American who had not thought through what living there actually meant. The shortages that Glenn Souther had found unbearable, the cultural isolation that had contributed to the deterioration of so many other defectors, the sheer daily difficulty of navigating a society in a language most Americans did not speak, in a system built on rules and procedures and informal networks that took years to understand. All of this hit Roberts within months. The Soviet Union of 1987 was also a specific and difficult moment. Mikhail Gorbachev had introduced perestroika and glasnost, economic restructuring, and political openness. But these reforms had not yet produced material improvement for ordinary Soviet citizens. In many ways, the transition period made things worse before it made them better, as the old command economy loosened without being replaced by anything that functioned better. Consumer goods were scarce. The ruble was not convertible. Travel was controlled. The infrastructure of daily life that most Americans took entirely for granted, the ability to buy what you needed when you needed it, the ability to move around freely, the ability to make a phone call to wherever you wanted, was absent or severely constrained. Robert's situation was also legally complicated in a way that trapped him between two systems. Going back to the United States meant facing Army desertion charges. The Uniform Code of Military Justice was clear on desertion. It was a serious offense, and Roberts had not simply gone AWOL briefly during peacetime with mitigating circumstances. He had gone AWOL, crossed into the Soviet Union, appeared in Soviet media as an asylum seeker, and allowed the Soviet Foreign Ministry to use his arrival as a propaganda item. The Army was not going to overlook that. At the same time, the Soviet Union was not a place he wanted to stay. The third country option, country hunting, in the Washington Post's phrase, was his attempt to find a way out of both traps simultaneously. Whether Roberts eventually found a third country, returned to the United States and faced charges, or remained in the Soviet Union through its collapse in 1991 and into the post-Soviet Russian Federation, is not documented in the public record in a way that this account can verify. The trail goes cold with the October 1987 Washington Post report about him sitting in a Moscow hotel, disillusioned and looking for options. He was 22 or 23 years old at that point. What happened to Wade Evan Roberts after October 1987 is, based on available documented sources, unknown. His West German girlfriend, P. Neumann, is similarly absent from the record after the initial Soviet Foreign Ministry announcement and the Moscow hotel report. Whether the couple stayed together through whatever happened next, whether the relationship that had apparently driven or accompanied his defection survived the conditions that followed it, the record does not say. What the Roberts case illustrates, more starkly than almost any other case in this account, is the gap between the decision to defect and the life that follows it. Every person in this account made a decision at a specific moment. Oswald in the Moscow hotel, Webster at the American exhibition, Martin and Mitchell on the flight to Mexico City, Hamilton in whatever meeting led to his July 1963 Izvestia interview, Howard rolling out of a car in the New Mexico desert, Souther on the flight from America to Rome, Lokshin at Houston Intercontinental Airport. Roberts made his decision on March 2, 1987, when he walked away from his base in Gießen. The decision is a single moment. What follows it is not. What follows it is every day after that moment, in a place that is not home, under conditions that were not fully imagined when the decision was made, without the ability to simply change your mind and go back. For Roberts, the gap between the decision and the reality was so complete that within 8 months he had abandoned even the Soviet Union's chosen location for him and was sitting in a Moscow hotel trying to think of somewhere else to go. The Army listed him as a deserter. The Soviet Foreign Ministry listed him as a man of progressive views who had been persecuted. Neither description captured what the Washington Post saw in October 1987. A young man from San Bernardino, far from home, in a country that was not what he thought it would be, looking for a way out of a situation he had not fully understood when he walked into it. His case is the shortest and in some ways the most honest of all the cases in this account. He defected,
He arrived. He saw what was there. He wanted out. He said so.
He was 22 years old, and he said so out loud to a journalist in 8 months, which is more self-awareness than some of the other people in this account managed in years. The pattern across all 8 cases in this account, the Marine, the plastics chemist, the 2 NSA cryptologists, the code breaker, the Navy photographer, the CIA officer, the cancer researcher, and the Army private, points toward a single conclusion that the Soviet Union's own press occasionally acknowledged, and that the defectors themselves confirmed in different ways and at different speeds. The country they chose was not the country they had imagined. The gap between the idea of the Soviet Union and the reality of living in it was total, and the cost of discovering that gap was paid entirely by the people who crossed it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.